I'm sure more people will filter. And thank you everybody for being here this evening. And I'm really thrilled that Eli agreed to jury the student show and that the committee selected him for this task. I've known about Eli's artwork for years, and anyone who has ever had me in photo one and digital imaging has known about it too. So yay. So Eli Craven is an artist that is based in Lafayette, Indiana, where he is an assistant professor of photography at Purdue University. He holds an MFA from the University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign, and Craven's research resides in the critical investigation of the image and its relationship to ideologies of sexuality, desire, and death. He works conceptually with photographic images, both found and original, by reevaluating the physical and psychological potential of the picture through sculptural and digital interventions. His work is exhibited nationally and internationally, and most recently at the Feinkunst Kruger Gallery in Hamburg, Germany, and at Filter Space in Chicago, Illinois. His work has been widely published. Select publications and clients include Philosophy Magazine, the Journal of Curriculum and Pedagogy, Gestalten Publishing in Berlin, Penguin Random House in Barcelona, and the Paris National Opera. I've taken some liberties here and I've asked a couple of your undergraduate professors to tell me something about you that I can include in this bio. One of whom has said, don't tell Eli, or excuse me, don't let Eli fool you. He can come off as a tough guy, but he's really a softie and saves a large part of his heart for his two kitties. So with that, here's Eli Craven. Thank you and welcome.
I think I have an idea who said that, but I don't know. It sounded like it was in Jonathan Sadler's voice. I don't know if I'm wrong, but could be somebody else. It just sounded like Jonathan Sadler. Thank you, Jacinda, and thank you everybody at Ball State. I'm super excited to be here. It was a lot of fun to jury the show, and now it's going to be fun to share my work with you. Let's see if we can share it. Okay, so I'll just pick up where I was at. So that's me. I'm from Idaho. I was born in a small town, Idaho Falls, and might just be kind of weird the way it scrolled, but that's okay. We can deal with it. As a small town, and it really heavily influenced the way I approach my practice and what really interested me in my practice. So for one thing, it was pre-internet. I was born in 1979, and so in the 1980s, being in that small town, I think we were just we were left to our own devices. We didn't have cable television. We didn't have a lot of movies or anything. So we basically just played outside, and then whatever images we came across, in magazines or in books or in movies we got to see were kind of precious. But in addition to the images being really precious in my childhood, it was a kind of a conservative home. My dad was very protective over what we saw. He thought any kind of adult imagery or graphic imagery or violent imagery was going to influence his kids, which probably most parents think this too. It's not a unique story. It's just a story that stuck with me. So the stories that I see, the images I see, it was filtered pretty heavily through what my father would show us. So I remember focusing pretty heavily on certain figures in my childhood, and from movies that I could see, Patrick Swayze being one, which we'll talk about in the lecture, but also Glenn Close and Michael Douglas from Fatal Attraction, and Isabella Rossellini and Kyle MacLachlan from Blue Velvet. The real interesting thing about it was we had these categories of movies when I was a kid, and there was the bottom shelf, and then there was this top shelf in our entertainment center. And the top shelf were my parents' movies, and we weren't allowed to touch them. If we found out we were touching those and putting them in the VCR, then we'd get in trouble. And so I'd watch bottom shelf movies with my sister, which were like accessible PG movies. And then the top shelf movies always fascinated me. And two that always stuck out with me were Fatal Attraction and Blue Velvet, movies I thought I was never going to see because they were just horrible. You know, they must have had some of the most graphic imagery and the most violent, horrendous stuff in them for them to be in the top shelf in the hidden cabinet. And so I think that kind of experience stuck with me. And so when I got a little bit older, I really just was fixated on imagery and what you could see and what you couldn't see. And the way images in the public, such as in magazines and in movies, start to influence your perceptions of how things should be, but there's a disconnect between the reality of our lives and what is projected through media. And so that's where the work really begins, as this circulation in my head. I'm going to try something different in this lecture, where in the past I've really kind of gone chronologically, but during the show, I really was interested in all this work being created during the pandemic and how circumstance and context really kind of influences what our output. And so I actually am going to talk about some projects in the context in which they were made, because I think I don't think it's necessarily special events, but I'm always highly aware of what's influencing changes in my work. And so I wanted to just talk about a little bit of that as I go through some projects. And yeah, just, and if somebody has a really good question, you can interrupt me because I'll start to ramble too. So the first section I wanted to talk about was space. Space was kind of an early identifier for me. And when I say space, I mean the kind of space that I'm allowed to work in. And I thought this was somewhat relevant because it really affected me for the first time when I graduated from my undergrad. So I did my undergraduate degree at Boise State University. And when I left, you know, I was a traditional photographer. I was taking pictures on film. I was developing film. I was working in a darkroom, which requires a lot of space. And when I left Boise State University, I didn't have the money or the means to maintain a space like that. And so I didn't have a studio. But what I did have is I really loved to thrift shop and estate sale shop. And I have a lot of collections of books and images, clothes. Me and my partner, Maria, we collect furniture and dishware. And so in some of this shopping, I have amassed these movie books and self-help books and vintage books that I really like. And when I lost space and I had nowhere to work, then I started to work at the kitchen table. And that was when I made this major shift in my work due to circumstance, and it was to start to play with collage. So when I'd found this book, Screen Lovers, I had noticed pretty clearly that it was, you know, it's based on classic Hollywood movies. So that is a very narrow representation of human beings. They're mostly beautiful human beings, but the book also depicted a lot of almost encounters. So they're all the screenshots from the films before anyone was kissing. So there was nothing really graphic. It was all just kind of implied romance. And so I started to cut them up at the kitchen table and just kind of fold and transform and move things around to make new compositions, but also new forms, and kind of activate the backside of the picture. And thinking about, it really was the first time I started to think about a photograph as an object, or some other type of material that wasn't just a two-dimensional plane to stare into. It was something that could be worked with and moved around. And initially, you know, I should also say that when I was manipulating these forms, sometimes I was creating these new obscure forms. Sometimes I was trying to kind of animate the picture. So I often will look at a photograph or an image and kind of dissect what's happening, and then it might tell, in a way, I'll have this intuitive response to kind of make it do something. So I was making some of these forms that merge with other forms to kind of complete the act. And eventually I started taking pictures from other books and trying, and in the same vein, still Hollywood, to kind of make performative acts take place that never took place before. For example, two leading men in a romantic embrace when they never were in the movie. I also found this collection of books called Woman Alive, which is a 1970s self-help catalog for women. It was very similar to a lot of self-help books that my mother had growing up, and so they were comical in a way, and also just very disconnected from reality, like I'd said before. So a lot of the images didn't really address a reality that I saw. They were pretty ridiculous and dated. And What Makes a Man Tick was a funny one. There's a lot of funny stuff in that one. But this project, response to it in that same mode, was that I took out my camera and I started photographing the book. And so following, and I was working on Screen Lovers, making collage, and realizing that the material was, photograph was a material I could play with. But then the books also became a subject matter, and then existing photographs also became subject matter, and I would photograph photographs or photograph pages in the book and then go in the darkroom and manipulate the exposure to block out certain images there. This is one example of some imagery that spoke to me, and it was kind of I think, examples of masculinity in the book, or teaching or learning masculinity and femininity in the book, that I felt like were very binary and segregated and prescriptive, and I didn't feel like my views aligned with it. So I would try to photograph these things and manipulate them. And this says, if you can't read the text, says, in many countries, it's considered perfectly natural for men to express their regard for their friends by greeting them with a hug or strolling along arm in arm with them. In our society, however, such spontaneous gestures of friendship are only permitted in childhood. So this was an unfinished piece, but it was a photograph I took with an intention to really kind of do something with it. But it was the type of material that I was kind of looking at and wanting to transform or distort, because I felt uncomfortable about the statement I was making. And the other thing that really turned in this collection of books and at this time was that I was starting to think about the picture frame and ways in which the photograph communicates with the picture frame and also can escape the picture frame. Very early ideas of that. My next section I titled Value, because it's something I started to think about a lot with found photography. And it came about when, these are all pictures of me through the years. I think that's age 0 through 12. I don't know. But something happened, and the incident in this case was that my mother had decided that she didn't want to hold on to the family's pictures anymore. And this was not one of those scenarios where my parents caught up with the times, got a computer, and then digitized a family collection. They were not computer savvy people. They just decided they didn't want it. They just wanted to get rid of it. So they sent me a box of the family's photographs. And within this box was all of my childhood pictures, but also pictures of my parents when they were younger, grandparents, sisters, like the whole family. And I sat with it for a long time, but eventually I started to kind of think about these photographs as weight and as material, and also as an unwanted material. So sort of disturbed me in a way that my mom didn't want to keep them, but I sort of understood I didn't want to carry them around either. Even though I've moved across the country a few times now in the past decade, I still have the box. And every time I move it somewhere or load it into a truck, I think it's kind of ridiculous. But I keep them. But she didn't want them, and that kind of struck me, I think. So I thought a lot, I mean, I went through the box and thought a lot about my childhood again and what that value was, what the value of a picture was, the value of a memory, and then also the value of a physical material and how a physical material can communicate or become real or become a thing. And so I started by making all those portraits you saw before. I made them into beach towels and drape on the wall, and that's one of those. And then I started trying to bend and form, and this is in a really early iteration of something I do a lot, where I make these corner pieces with these reflective materials. It's just a photograph on a panel with a brass sheet. It's a reflective brass sheet. It's really rudimentary. The picture looks pretty good, but if you saw these in person, I think it was just such an early iteration that I think the quality of construction wasn't quite there, but it catches up to me later. That's an old photo of my mother that she gave away. It's also my mother with a perforated aluminum sheet. And again, and I was really, while these were kind of early ideas, I really just wanted to make these photographs physical forms that came off the wall in some of the most simplest ways. And that was a young portrait of my father. And this is actually an installation view. These, and just for scale, these are about 4 feet by 4 feet, and this is about 3 feet by 2 feet. And this is another 2 feet by 3 feet piece, but it's placed into the wall behind a copper pipe. So the copper pipe runs through the wall and is drywalled into the wall. And then at the same time, I'm kind of parsing through my own family history and this sort of value. I was doing a lot of, because I have this large collection of found imagery and found materials, and I watch eBay listings all the time for photographers, and I found this Los Angeles-based photographer that had a whole bunch of Hollywood portraiture and from the 80s, 90s, 2000s. He was older and auctioned off a bunch of his stuff, and I bought a few that I was able to get cheaply, and I got a bundle of negatives of Patrick Swayze portraits. This was one of them, and it reminded me that I liked these figures from my childhood that I was really attracted to. Not attracted to, and it means like I want to date Patrick Swayze, but then it means like I almost like a role model in a weird sort of way, or a curiosity. So I really loved action movies as a kid. I'm sure other people did too. I watched a lot of cartoons, and like Superman was big in the 80s, like the original Christopher Reeve Superman. And Patrick Swayze always interested me because he was this character, or this figure that was like, he was an action star. He did movies like Roadhouse, and he was physically masculine in that way, but then he was also a very feminine figure. He was a ballet dancer and had some sort of grace to him. So I was always really fascinated by this kind of these two sides to Patrick Swayze, and then the respect that he carried versus a general disrespect towards, having effeminate qualities when I was a kid, because you'd get teased and beat up for being shy, quiet, sensitive. So he kind of leaked into the work. This is a project called PS, which stands for Patrick Swayze, but also Postscript, or a number of other PS values. I was thinking of it, but it's just the initials PS. And it was this combination of, there's still the building material is coming into it, like the perforated aluminum sheets, references to home materials and like physical construction are happening as sculpture, but there's still photographs of me in there. That's me inside of this grate on this marble slab with a book on it. And then that's a towel of me draped over this fogged up picture of Patrick Swayze. And then in installation, this is a slide of Patrick Swayze that is hung vertical on the wall with a light kind of glowing through it, so you can see the slide. Because at this point, Patrick Swayze had passed away from cancer, and so he was not alive anymore. So I thought of him as this kind of like godlike figure looking down on the installation or something. And then the wig kind of was this happenstance that came into there as well, thinking about, because I was thinking about his movie, Thanks for Everything, To Wong Fu, Thanks for Everything, Julie Newmar, where him and a few others played drag queens and cross-dressers and performers. And that was just another moment that played into like these two sides of this figure. And then also right at the same time, I'm also finding these materials. And while I was thinking about my own value in my family's portraiture, I found this little trifold at the thrift store. That's Joaquin, Angel, and Rosa. And I don't know who they are or where they're from, but I made this homage to their trifold as like this tail end of this big project. So some of the same materials, but also I had found this found book of flower bouquet design and talked a lot about flower bouquets for grieving and for funeral processes, things like that. And so I use these as kind of these stand-ins for in memoriam, because I didn't know their identities and I didn't know who they were, and I didn't know who cast off their images, but I was really kind of just really drawn into these images and wanted to know what is it about physical belongings and wanting to keep them for only so much time, and then what's the circumstance in which we no longer have a personal tie to something in an image. Next group is politics. I'm not technically a political artist, I guess. I don't really think about it, but I do think that whatever's happening seeps into the work for sure. And with politics, I mean, I think we tend to think about the like political things, like the Republican Party, the Democratic Party, who's running for president, and that does seep into the work. But I also think about groups. Groups making decisions for groups is also one of the general definitions of what a politic is. And so this work started in about 2016, late 2016, when we had that very first divisive election of Clinton versus Trump. I was working with a book that I'd found called Deutsch Portraits. And Deutsch Portraits was a book of German portraiture that came out in 1961. A German photographer compiled all these portraits. And to me, it sat on my shelf for a very long time, but it read as this sort of response or, reaction to probably how Germany was viewed after World War II, post-World War II. And because it was like the philosophers, the thinkers, the religious figures, some of the best in Germany were all featured in this book. And at the same time, I'm flipping through this book, looking at portraits of the best of a nation. So like the so-called best of a nation. I don't know, who curates this, but that's the general idea. I also was thinking very earnestly about how you could see the country starting to really expose its divides racially and politically in 2016, late 2016. And so that split just got me to thinking about what would our American portrait book look like in 15 years from now, or what's it going to look like in 5 years from now, or what even is an American portrait? Who are Americans? Because I think there's a few different, very clear ideas, split views of what American portraiture is, and it's only gotten even more divided, in my opinion. But I think that's kind of where this work took form. It was exploration. I wanted to kind of was making collages like this anyway, and I wanted to include the frame, but I think the whole time I was making it, I was just thinking about nationality. And at the same time, right at the tail end of this kind of thinking, I was invited to do a show at a space called Demo Projects in Springfield, Illinois. It was a university gallery there at the University of Illinois Springfield, and the university owned some homes that were slated for demolition, but they weren't going to be demoed for a number of years, 5 to 10 years. And so the art department there took over one and had a gallery space there, and they called it Demo Project. So I had an exhibition there, and this was in January of 2017. So it's still kind of thinking the same things, but I was also, a little exhausted about that thought. And to imagine 4 years later, politics is still really exhausting. But so I had been making towel work and printing images on fabric. And initially, it was kind of a comical play to kind of, use the language of a hand towel and then actually make hand towels, which I think is really funny. But it also became kind of serious as I started to see, like, I'd hang these hands on these rods, and it really felt like they were just barely hanging on. And it felt kind of like heavy and light at the same time, which is really how I was feeling at the time. Another install shot there. Next is collaboration. Trying to move quickly so I don't go really late, but this is a project called Swimming and Diving. I do collaborate often. I've collaborated with a number of artists. Anybody that really wants to, I'm always open to it. I think it's a lot of fun to kind of feed off of other people, and it always changes the outcome of things. But my constant collaborator is my partner, Maria Chavez, my wife. She and I have collaborated on projects since 2012, and we have a series of collaborations that we're both really interested in. It's in their reevaluations of the American Red Cross safety manuals. And so we did canoeing, and we wanted to keep going, and so we did swimming and diving. It's a book, a guide for swimming and diving safety. And so we reinterpret them, and we reinterpret them as, we reinterpret the language, but we also reinterpret the imagery, because some of it can seem somewhat iconic, somewhat dated. It can be exclusionary. So some things we were thinking about when we made this work. This here is actually a photograph of a sculpture we made. It's a life vest in latex. And then there's a stack of those vests there in latex there with a framed diagram of a back somersault dive. Yeah, it's a back somersault. And we were really thinking about, like, how iconic some of the diagrams looked, and we were thinking about human value at the time. There was a lot of talk about immigration. This was in 2018, and it was a very, I don't want to say the word hot topic because it seems silly, but I'll say hot topic because I can't think of another word. It was a hot topic. And but we were thinking a lot about immigration and people, especially in Europe, and Syrians and immigrants coming across seas and over waters and into our country. It was just, and so I think it seeped into the work quite a bit to be thinking about saving lives and human value. There was some photography in there. It was a lot of sculpture and video work. Here's a video from there, which I actually think I'll share real quick. There you go. Okay, so back to that. I'll just go ahead and skip. We actually displayed a video, and you can see another image of it there. And you can see my PDF again now, right, Jacinda? Yes? Okay.
Yes, sorry.
Just making sure. So the video was displayed in this corner, and we had this silicone sheet that kind of floated in the space to kind of to break it up.
Hey! Welcome to Creative Block.
Oh my gosh. YouTube took over. Okay, I took care of that. So yeah, you can just watch that video in the link if you want to, and you'll see the way you can walk around and move within the video, and like it kind of becomes a part of the space. It's something we're trying to work with. This was a life-saving device that we built out of wood, beeswax, and boat buoys, and we had a video installation there. I won't try to get to that one. I think I took too much time getting to the first one, but we actually tested this one out and had a body swim it out into the water and use it. And there's a video of that. Some examples of the framed work, the diagrams, which leads to the next section, which is all about labor and framework. The frame and the construction of the work that I'm making is really important. And for a number of years, I worked as a woodworker. I built furniture. I built bookshelves and dining room tables and coffee tables and stuff for a furniture maker. And so inevitably, it just really just kind of seeped into the work. I started using a lot of wood scraps and just making these types of wooden boxes and wooden frames. And I got a little bit better at my craft. And so I think it just kind of became another piece in the puzzle to communicate with the photograph. These works were called Human Figure, and they're just found images and found book pages with walnut. And I started making these corner pieces, which I've been really into. I'm kind of obsessed with it because I feel like it gives a dimension to the photo that I've been thinking about for years, which is that there's another side to the photo, or a physical space in the photo that relates to a reality that I think is missing in a lot of the photography I use. So this is that scale on that one's about 24 inches by 16 inches by 6 inches, I think. And it's a brass sheet with walnut and an inkjet print. And there's a whole series of these that kind of exhibited together with the brass sheets and then digital photographs and digital collage. In the same way I was using the woodwork, I'm also thinking about not just how you experience them, but how, like, having materials that force you to experience it in a certain way. And so like the perforated aluminum sheets cast light, but also kind of act as a lens over some of the work, but also an obstruction, which I'm really interested in. And then my last section relates very heavily to why I even spread it up into sections, and it's isolation. And I think the whole time I was during the show, I just kept thinking about how art is, for me, in a lot of ways, it's a community thing. I love to share the work. I love to talk to others about their work, and I love to collaborate. And for the past year, I've really felt like I've just made this work in isolation. And it's difficult to stay motivated, which is why I found some of the work in the show, in the jurying process, so impressive. But I think it's also seeped into my work in a very interesting way. It's sometimes in these moments my work gets dark or it gets kind of sad, but this was a piece called Periphery that was in a show in Chicago recently at the ARC Gallery. And the show was called Solitude, and I think the theme was to talk about our solitude or our isolation. And I like, this is a found image that I placed into this kind of context, and I like that it's, I mean, it's unclear whether the original woman in this image was kissing someone or just making this gesture in space. But I think I was thinking a lot about like what people do in isolation or what people do in solitude, and thinking also about the concept of narcissists and self-obsession, but also about this, like, there's like this seriousness to it, but there's also this comic teenager kind of practicing kissing in the mirror, which I thought was really funny, the way these two mesh together in this piece. And then, so that was kind of this is one of the most recent things I've finished in isolation. This was one of the first things I made when we kind of quarantined last March in 2020. I didn't know, because it was another one of those things where I was just ejected from a studio, and I couldn't access my studio in those first months of quarantine. So I really just had nothing to do but make some digital collage or take photographs, but then I couldn't even do anything with the photographs. So I started making these collages of artworks from Art Forum and art books and art magazines that we had, and just kind of disrupting or manipulating them, or almost totally obliterating the artworks, because it seemed like I was missing it, but also it was absent. And then this very recent work is, these are just something I made this week that I was going to end on two things that I'm really doing. This was, these are a collection of photographs of people kissing that I've been manipulating in Photoshop, making digital collages using patchwork tools. I'm testing tools in Photoshop to see how they interact or respond in ways they're not supposed to. But then in playing around, I kind of discovered that I could make these really obscure patchwork collages, and kind of relating to this desire for physical contact, but then also this melding of physical bodies, and thinking a lot about people like my partner and I, who are still isolating at home so much, and it's probably the most time we've spent together in our entire relationship. But then at the same time feeling like this is bizarreness, weirdness to our bodies and what's out there, and like fear. And then the last image is what's starting, as I tend to work on a lot of projects at the same time. And this is starting with the same thing. We're thinking a lot about this past year and the conversations about health and COVID. Turning back to one of those books, which is a first aid Red Cross manual, but this first aid Red Cross manual is entirely made up of hand-drawn illustrations. And so I've been taking these hand-drawn illustrations and be setting them up in the studio and making photographs based on them, and then inevitably they'll become sculptures. But kind of where I'm at right now, it's just kind of processing all the information of the past year and putting it into forms. But that's it. That's all I have. It's a lot. It's like flew through it, but
Well, thank you so much.
yeah, I'll go ahead and stop, and then see if anybody has questions.
I'm getting a lot of questions, but people are sending them directly to me, so it probably looks like no questions. But please ask questions, and I'm going to start going through the ones that I have here. This is from Sydney. She says, how do you go about determining what we see of the photograph and what we don't see?
That's a really good question. You know, it depends on what I'm thinking about in those moments. Oftentimes there's works where I'm really drawn to a particular aspect of the image. So for some of those, like for example, the images of my mother, what was really important was I wanted to kind of have this conversation about what's seen and what's unseen, and not about what's said, because I felt like she was a woman who was silenced by the relationship with my father, and the kind of materials that she was caught up in, those kind of books that I talked about earlier. She played a certain role that I felt kept her very silent. So I think the eyes were really important in those. But with a lot of the images, I'm less concerned with like a physical representation, and so often the faces get covered quite a bit. But if there's a hand gesture that I'm really just attracted to, then I have to show that. I can't cover that. And then it kind of goes that way. It's really a lot of gut instinct and feeling. And that's something I didn't really quite mention a lot, is that I think emotion plays an important factor in the work. That how I'm feeling, like if I'm feeling sad because of isolation or like events that are happening around the world or in my family. If the like, things are taking over my emotions, then it really kind of changes what I do to the work.
Yeah, that was a great question to start us off with. So I definitely encourage more questions. But the second one comes from Kyla. And she says, when your parents got rid of the family photographs, did it affect the art you were making? Were you making collage before? Did it spark the art and collage using found photographs? Were you using found photographs before then?
Those are all really good questions. So yeah, I'd used a few found photographs before then. When my parents gave me that box, I sat with it for a long time because I didn't think I didn't think I wanted to be an artist that made work with their childhood pictures. Like I was overthinking things at the time. So I made a lot of collage work with found images before I got to that. But when I got to that, I think I was ready to explore using found imagery in a different fashion. Like I didn't want to just make collage. I wanted to make installation or sculpture or something bigger. And that's why I went straight to making them into beach towels, because I wanted to kind of drape them, put them over things. And then inevitably, there's always, this happens a lot with me too, that there's a mashup of stuff. So I started digging through the box and wanting to use it. And at the same time, I was thinking a lot about like found materials outside of photography. So I would go to like the Habitat for Humanity restore and look through discarded construction materials as a means of using for art materials, just because I, as a builder, and I do woodworking, and so it's second nature for me, but it's also it just felt hand in hand to kind of pick up that material along with the used old like material with history rather than new material, you know? So a lot of the perforated aluminum sheets and those brass sheets came into the work because they were taken from building stores like that.
I was curious about the brass.
They're actually, the first ones I used were kick plates. They were like brass kick plates for the base of doors.
Okay.
But they're reflective, like mirror materials. Mm-hmm. I started putting them into the work.
What has been the most challenging framing process in your work? That's actually a really good segue. Brass to framing.
I can show you if I can find it. It wasn't in the presentation, but I can tell you right now, because there's a folder on my, because I was looking at it just the other day. I'm going to search. Wait, here it is. Okay, I opened it. Okay. So we'll do share screen again. Can you see that?
Mm-hmm.
So that is a frame I made that's got a perfect like little curved arc off the wall. And the corner frames are complicated because they have to be precise, like all these 90-degree angles and stuff like that, but you can totally work with that. This was one of the most complicated ones I made because there's no true way to, you can't run it through a table saw and you can't run it through a chop saw. I don't have access to a CNC router, so I was just like hand carving the two rabbited arcs of the frame to kind of mold the image in there. So that was probably the most complex one. But
I think there are a lot of seniors thinking about their thesis show right now, so that question probably stems from that.
But yeah, I mean, just framing your work is pretty simple. Oh gosh, the work of the trifold with the flowers over the faces, that was called PPS. Those were really complicated because there's a picture frame on the outside, and they're about 3 feet tall by 2 feet wide. And so there's this picture frame on the outside with that perforated aluminum sheet embedded with an image behind it, but then I also installed a picture within that frame that had to be braced in to cover the face. And so there's two frames kind of built together with pictures within and behind, and that was really complicated. I never wanted to do it again. It worked, but I didn't want to do it again. It was too hard.
All right, so this is my last question in the chat. So if there's anyone else that wants to add anything to this, I should say the last question that was direct message to me. Do you prefer working digitally in Photoshop or three-dimensionally with your hands?
That's a really good question. I like them both a lot. I think, oh gosh, yeah, I don't know, about the same. I think I used to use Photoshop just as like a tool to mock things up. So very early on in the work, when I'd find a found image that I thought was really important, I was really nervous. I'm sure some people can relate to this. I was really nervous to cut it or fold it because it's the one I had. And so if you do something to it and you ruin it, you're done. And so I would scan them sometimes in Play in Photoshop to see like, oh, if I fold here or cut here, I can make something that I like. And so then I'll attack it physically or go for it. And through that process, I found that I like doing digital things to the work as well. But I really love, I love working in the wood shop. So I'd say both.
A magic other direct message has appeared. And it's from Abby, and she asks, what do you find inspiring about found images overtaking your own?
Gosh, you know, I've been thinking about it a lot lately because I really want to I want my own images in the work. I've been wanting it for a long time. But the thing that I just can't get away from is it's like an addiction, the searching for and finding found images. And so no matter, I mean, I have project ideas that just need me to take the photos because there's nothing found that will work. And so I'm doing that. But whenever I come across something or discover a book or a discarded box of photographs, I can't help myself. I think it's like an addiction. I did a lot of readings when I was in my MFA program, and I could have to come back to you with some authors, but they were about collecting and how acts of collecting are related to like triggers in the brain that relate to desire and satisfaction and pleasure. And so there's an adrenaline rush when you find something as a collector and when you get to complete, like add to a collection. And so I still think about that all the time, that when you actually go to an estate sale and there's something of value to you, either for my art practice or just something I want for my home, that it's a particular kind of excitement. And I think found images bring that too. And I also love the anonymity. I get lost thinking like what these people are like and where they come from and who they are.
Does anyone else have any questions before I whip out my last one? Well, it was Lori who said that in the intro, but this is what Jonathan Sadler has to say.
Sounded like John, but I guess Lori and John have a similar tone.
So in undergraduate school, Eli was the hardest working student artist I've ever had. He worked at a restaurant. He seemed to always be at school working on art. He got A's in academic courses, and he even rented a studio. It seems like he was everywhere at once. He also participated or attended in as many art openings and events as he could possibly fit in. All this is to say, he took art seriously and treated it like a full-time job, and it shows. So now that everyone knows this about you, I want to know what kind of advice that you would give students that would want to pursue the path of being a professional artist. And you come from a background with a lot of publications, a lot of exhibitions in international spaces, but knowing that you came from that, like what kind of advice could you give them?
I would have to say that I'm trying to think of like the best advice if we're thinking about what I did. So one of the reasons Lori probably says that is because I mean, just to break like any kind of idea of who I am, I don't have any other hobbies. So like some of you in the chat or watching this, you might like to go hiking, or you might like to go boating, but I don't do anything else. Like this is all I do. Like ever since I decided I want to be an artist, my life kind of revolved around it. It's probably unhealthy. I actually would say my advice would be to have a hobby, so you have like outlets and breaks. But I think one of the reasons that like Lori probably said that about me is because I was just obsessed and I wouldn't stop. And I still don't. I think my partner and I talk about art all the time. It's our lives. My friends are artists, and I don't really have friends that aren't artists because I don't know what we would talk about. I can't talk about, snowmobiling. I don't care about snowmobiling. So I guess I would say like, yeah, you have to work hard. I'd say persevere and like don't stop. But follow your intuition and put your work on the internet. If there's any of you that are really, really serious and you don't have a website or an Instagram or a Facebook or a Twitter or whatever, like I'd say why? So you should just, because that's been one of the biggest tools for me is just being able to connect with people virtually. Because I think it's the thing right now that there are curators and collectors and collaborators already online, and they're actually looking for things on the internet. You don't have to attend a portfolio review or a big event in New York City to see someone in New York City. You can connect that way. While physical things are important, I'd say get it out there. That's my best advice.
Well, thank you so much, Eli. Thanks for joining our show, and everyone, the opening virtually on Saturday. So be there at 6. Eli's going to be giving his juror statement then too. But thank you so much.